asked to give some introduction to societal security as a concept, the ivory tower perspective to be presented to the policy perspectives that are around this table. Well, yeah, I call this avoiding voluntary apartheid. We just heard that we are not allowed to leave the building without permission. You cannot enter without your passport, and this is part of the new world that we live in. We have moved border controls to every street corner and to every main building, and that's part of today's network society, and part of the things that I hope to address in this context. Let's see whether this works. Yes, let's give some context. Let's start with a very general question. How do 7.4 billion people relate to each other in terms of cooperation and conflicts? That's the kind of overarching question when it comes to security studies. We tend to take a world society perspective rather than a national one and wonder how the world looks outside of us. No, let's start from the outside and look inwards and try to make sense of the population on this planet, which is not an easy thing to do, of course. There are various ways in which we do this. On the one hand, perhaps we have individuals. I'm not sure it's a very liberal starting point, but let's accept it for the moment that we have these 7.4 billion individuals on the one hand, and we have something that we call world society. We refer to it. Sometimes it's called the global village, a term that already emerged in the 1970s, and it's a very romantic term. It's the idea of a countryside village where everyone knows each other and we interact with each other and we feel comfortable. No, it's a global megalopolis. It's an area where you don't know each other and where well, there is a lot of things to fear on the streets, so to say. There are a lot of factors in between. First of all, identity groups, and that's the heart of societal security concerns. It's about identity. We develop identities individually at a personal level. I develop them as groups, sometimes as nations, as tribes, as classes, as, well, gender, civil society, religion. You can find all kinds of identity groups around, and probably you're all part of some of them. Well, it's different sciences actually who try to make sense of that. Psychology has an idea of how we form our identities. Anthropology has an idea of how we do this. Sociology is talking about it. So it's a very complex area in trying to understand how we form our identities and how we live with them. Well, the other one is more familiar for political sciences. It's sovereign states. We interpret most of world politics in terms of state-centric policies. If you look at the news, if you look at the politicians, even if you look at the economists, it's often state-centric what they present to us. This is the world, 193 or a bit more sovereign entities that occupy all the territories, almost all the territories of the world, and that's how we have organized it at the moment. In that relation, we have learned to live with some of the defaults of the system. So we have international organizations. We are here in the middle of one. It's the European Commission, the European Union as one, the UN system, NATO, ASEAN, hundreds of intergovernmental organizations, thousands of non-governmental organizations, all trying to make sense of what societies, identity groups, and sovereign states are doing. Then we go to markets, the economic sector with their main actors, firms, transnational corporations, if you want to, and that more or less structures the contemporary world world society as we look at it. The identity discourse on societal security is strongly linked to that of sovereign states. We see the ideal of nation states, a 19th century, mainly European invention, although it has roots elsewhere as well, combined often with a social Darwinist idea that we as a nation need to survive on our territory. And so there's a strong linkage there between the societal security concerns and the sovereignty ones in many instances. You see this much less in the economic realm, and that's good to realize. Well, if we look at this structure, you can see it's caught in three main discourses: an identity discourse related to societal security, a sovereignty discourse often related to military and political security, but also to economic and societal one, and an economic discourse related to our markets, etc. Historically, perhaps we can see that after the Cold War, the economic discourse made a kind of victory. World society is strongly dominated by the liberal international economic order, one capitalist structure that's embraced worldwide, perhaps not by all identity groups in this world, but at least by the dominant ones, and certainly by the dominant powers in the world. And that might have to do, that victory might have to do something with the return of the type of societal concerns that we see nowadays, the securitization of identities. Because there is a downside to this international liberal economic order, which is related, well, some people call it the flip side of globalization. There is a lot of things that are not organized by markets. On the contrary, they might be disrupted by it. Think of environmental issues, climate change, and structural divides between poor and rich, the north-south divide. All these kind of things are embedded in the liberal international economic order, and we see all kind of responses to it, including waves of migration, civil wars, and other things. So there is something about these three discourses that we need to follow. In that context, we see a lot of security discourses, and let me explain you briefly a kind of bullet point version of securitization theory. Normally it takes at least a semester to study the ins and outs of this approach, but let's start somewhere. We all live in a reproductive structure, or let's call it the normal order, which is characterized by all kind of sedimented values, and which also includes all kind of security concerns. Our states are examples of that. Our societies are examples of that. In states, we see, for example, security concerns institutionalized in the form of armies, police forces, judiciary, intelligence, the penitentiary systems, etc. You see all kind of measures in society that take care of previous concerns that we had about our security and our well-being. It's in one sense, it's remarkable how stable the normal order is. If you just consider what it took to copy-paste yesterday into today, and what it will take to copy-paste today into tomorrow, we do something very remarkable, or very stupid, I don't know. But it's a remarkable development that we are able, well, we all expected that we could indeed be here today, have our breakfast, etc. And probably people in prisons had the same expectations about today as well. And so it's for better or for worse. Those who were poor yesterday are still today, and those who are rich, well, some might have gone bankrupt, but most of them are in the same position. So there is something remarkable about this normal order, but at the same time we're constantly concerned about how it develops, and so we see a lot of problems, and therefore we have invented something that we call politics. We discuss about these things. In democracies, we discuss them in a different way than in autocracies, but the principle is the same. There is always a group of people, ideally the entire population, but at least some part of the elite, that has to take decisions about how to deal with problems, how to solve them, how to avoid new ones from popping up. Well, this is the normal thing, and that's where securitization comes in. That's part of the theory. Some of these problems are singled out as being extremely urgent. If we don't deal with them today, we are in trouble. In the Netherlands, we always call it dikes. When the dikes break, ladies and gentlemen, we all have wet feet. And we can't go on as normal as we did. And therefore, even in our institutionalized, sedimented values is dike protection. It's one of the oldest public forms of government that we have waterschappen, that we have bodies who control the flows of water or try to do so. And, but in other countries, you have other traditions in that sense. So there are issues that take precedence over others. And, well, for academics, it would be very nice if we could make calculations and say, well, okay, this year's list of urgent issues is the following, and then we pass them on to the politicians and the ministries, and they take care of it, and that's it. That's not how it works. It's a political, intersubjective process in which we define what we think is urgent. And this might be right, it might be wrong. And the problem is also, even if you talk about the dikes and everyone agrees, yes, we need them, how much money do we want to invest in them? There is global sea rise on the horizon, so should we spend a few millions or a few billions on it to respond to these kind of things? That's all based on expectations, so it's on risk analysis and threat perceptions. And in a process of securitization, these threat perceptions are mobilized. I could perhaps define securitization as the mobilization of fear, often in anger. And then by means of a speech act, you say, hey, watch out, something is happening there. And then everyone will look in that corner and say, oh, and then we need to take measures to do something. And if we take the measures, we can go back to normal. Related to that is a demand for extraordinary measures. We need to do something now, because otherwise we are lost tomorrow. That's the price we have to pay today. And so we are demanding that price, and we are legitimizing our extraordinary measures. It can be a pandemic. We're discussing health security here today. Well, the risk of a pandemic, we don't want to wait till it occurs. We want to be preventive, so we want to act in advance and therefore take measures. And that's then what happens. The purpose, of course, is that we then get rid of the problem somehow. Well, this is not very well theorized, but there are 4 options in which this can happen. First is problem solved. There were fears of a pandemic, Ebola spreading all around the world, other diseases. We worked hard to get the vaccines. We might have programs even to install them. And at some moment, the World Health Organization might announce, okay, things are more or less under control. Well, in most cases, we see something else. We see institutional adaptation. We will change our daily routines. We will change our reproductive structure and institutionalize our security concerns. The kind of security measures that we are enduring here today, or when you take a plane somewhere, are a result of these kind of things. Something bad might happen, so we treat you as a suspect until you are on board. And that's then normalized. That's at some point the new structure in which we accept these things for happening. Another one is change of discourse. There might be another overriding concern, the argument of a common enemy. If aliens land, we might probably be suddenly changing our security agendas a bit. It might be that indeed other problems take over. But it can also be a change of discourse because we somehow circumvent the problem. Well, Europe is famous for its integration process, and that's exactly what we did in the 1940s, 50s, late 40s, early 50s, by not trying to solve the animosity, the societal security concerns between France and Germany, but by simply stop talking about it. Do something else. Create functional cooperation in the fields of coal and steel, and create an international process based on a different kind of logic, in which we simply don't care whether we like them or not. We just cooperate or not, and perhaps make jokes. So there is a kind of depoliticization, even beyond desecuritization, of an issue by simply walking around it, ignore it. In my view, this, especially when it comes to societal security issues, is the best way of trying to get rid of them. Because societal issues tend to be about intangible stakes. It's about the flag. It's about the book, the holy book. It's about the motherland. It's about things that symbolize all kind of things, and people are willing to die for it, let alone that they are willing to give up their opinions for it. They will never do that. So there are ways and lessons here of trying to change the discourse might be the most suitable one. Question is how. Case lost is, of course, the other option. You warn for something, but you're simply too late. Climate change might be a good example. We're all afraid of rising sea levels and rising temperatures, and we keep talking and take some measures, and then 10 years later we don't have to talk about it anymore because it's there already. So there is a whole list of things in that context to be studied. This reproductive structure is worthwhile to look at in a bit more detail. This normal order, especially when we want to understand the societal security dimension of it, is by looking at 3 pillars of governance that we probably know from your textbooks when you did political science or some related studies. Coercion and capital and identity. The 3 are based on the famous works of Charles Tilly and Benedict Anderson, who wrote powerful books on these processes. Tilly on coercion and capital. In case you don't know, read it. He analyzes European state formation processes and concludes that it's a process of organized crime. He links the kind of power formations not to a kind of voluntary social contract that we established with our rulers, like Hobbes would have it or Rousseau would have it. No, it's a process of exploitation and accumulation of means of coercion and means of capital to rule specific territories. And then we are concerned about it, how that works. The other corner, the identity corner, works in a different way. It adds myth to a national story, to the rule. And especially in the 19th century, rulers have become extremely effective in achieving this unity. And that's then part of what we see. But it's in crisis. It's constantly in crisis, ever since its inception, actually. So there is nothing new. If you compare our concerns today with those of the 19th century, they are not that different. But we have a new kind of face, and let's briefly reflect on that. There are always regional and global dynamics that escape the control of the national setting, that escape the control of our politicians. Whether you're in a superpower or in Luxembourg, it doesn't matter. There are limits to what you can do. There is a kind of inability to rule, and that's partly related to the success of this liberal international economic order I was talking about. So especially the success of these market structures, the global power of corporations and the processes related to that make us feel insecure in many different ways. And here I need to recall the flip side of globalization. Our concerns about migration, our concerns about symptoms of something much bigger, about global structures, but still we have somehow to deal with it, and then we have politicians who fall back to the traditional idea that let's have a state-centric solution for this. Let's build walls as a solution. It doesn't matter whether it works, but you have at least an effective policy that you can promote. You have clear emergency measures. Because that's one of the things in a securitization process. You can point at a problem, but you also have to point at a solution. Because if you don't point at the solution, what's the point in emphasizing the problem? And that also explains why some things are not on the security agenda, perhaps, where you would expect them. I'm now tempted to give one example. My favorite example here is traffic accidents versus terrorist casualties. You know the facts and figures? That worldwide we have yearly about 1.2 million people who die in traffic. In the European Union, it's now down to about 32,000 per year. People who are killed in the strength of their life by cars mainly, not by bombs. And in the US, it's roughly the same figure, 33,000 casualties a year. They are declining. It's a concern. It's not that we ignore it, but it's not as high on the security agenda as a terrorist threat. Worldwide, over the past 10 years, on average, around 20,000 casualties from terrorist attacks. But in terms of societal concern, much higher on the agenda. In Europe, it's low. It's at best, at most, in the hundreds, and then often related to tragic, isolated events. But our concern with these exceptional events is extraordinary. We somehow want extraordinary measures against the threat perception that is linked to these things, and that's where this tension comes in. We try to find solutions to these threats in our familiar settings, and these are national states. And that's partly one of the problems that we are looking at. I think there is a relationship with this new phase of globalization. It's interesting to recall what Benedict Anderson did in his work on imagined communities. Why does he say we are imagined communities? Well, for the simple reason you don't know all your country fellow men, like you know all your family members. And perhaps it's better not to know them as, well, let's not go into family trouble here, but you don't know everyone who belongs to your nation. Yet I'm Dutch. I don't know all 17 million of them. And I identify like that. And I'm even cheering for the Dutch soccer team. I have no clue why. But somehow in my education, this seemed to be important. And I internalized that feeling, apparently. So, and that happens to a lot of us. So the national identification is quite strong. He explains it in a historical setting from the invention of the printing press. He talks about printing capitalism, and he says the fact that we were able to publish in our own languages and communicate, create cultures in our own languages, and has been very important in creating these national identities. And in that context, it's interesting to see how these things work. It might well be that our new world with social media is leading to a situation where in 30, 40, 50 years from now, a new Benedict Anderson will conclude something similar about the kind of structures that were introduced by social media, which perhaps are asocial media. People being locked up in their own Facebook groups, only communicating with the people they know worldwide. Yes, it's a network, but it's a closed network. It's a voluntary apartheid structure in which we only communicate, and we only hear dangerous things from the outside world. We hear dangerous things of the public realms around us. It seems that we are confronted with a new kind of complexity, and therefore I'd like to conclude by looking briefly at the work of Norbert Elias, who has written remarkable things a long time ago. Here he wasn't always this old, by the way. Norbert Elias, who has been writing on the process of civilization a long time ago, where you find the same kind of corners. He argues that when people are confronted with increasing complexity and interdependence, their first natural inclination is to isolate themselves from it, to withdraw, to go back on your own boundaries, so to say. And if they discover that this doesn't fail, that the walls don't work, there is often an aggressive phase after that, imperialism. Try to control the complexity. Let's make America great again. Let's rebuild the Soviet Union. Time is up. So it's these kind of elements that you see. It's isolationism, the risk of a new kind of imperialism, and only in the third stage, according to Elias, people are willing to cooperate, people are willing to give and take, accept the complexity, and live with that. Well, apparently in our decade, we see something that is a longing to this isolationism. It's almost a kind of negative image of the 1960s, where we had a kind of zeitgeist, spirit of the age, which was qualified by flower power and anarchy, and let's be anti-authoritarian. We see now a kind of opposite movement, where people want to withdraw in their own castles, make them strong again, have your Brexit, have your walls around Europe, have your walls around the countries within Europe, have your walls around the European Union buildings. And probably it's a temporary phase, so we have to be patient and see how we survive it. Thank you.